Well, we've been talking about information a little bit. There's a whole field of science called information theory that deals with how information is transmitted and so on and where it comes from. And we sort of know what information is. I mean, you pick up a book and it's got information in it. But how do we define it? Well, we found that a good definition of it entails three quantities. I'm simplifying this a little bit for time's sake. But basically, information always involves a code system, a symbolic code system. So when you pick up a book and it's got a word like lion in it, you don't actually see a lion there. You don't see the animal. You see a word that represents the animal. Okay, so it's symbolic. It's a code system. It always entails language. Most of the books you read are probably English, but there are other languages as well. There are computer languages and all kinds of different languages that have syntax and grammar and rules of that nature. And there's meaning. When you read a book, there's something that you can learn from it. There's an expected action. There's an intended purpose. When you read a cookbook, the expected action is that you'll produce the product that it's describing how to make, and the purpose is so you can eat something, okay? And so that's an example of information. So here's a possible example of information. Could this be information? Well, it could be. It looks like there might be a code system there. It turns out it is information, and the way you can tell is you can decode it. If you decode it and it means something, then you know you've got information, right? And it turns out this is actually Genesis 1 through 5, right? Let's take a look at it here. It says, in the beginning, at a clipboard, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And so on. Well, you can read the rest of that there. But you can see it's Genesis told in a sort of a symbolic form, using different symbols than we're normally acquainted with. So really interesting, isn't it? But when you have information like that, and we know this has information because we can decode it, when you have information, certain rules apply, certain laws of nature, just like you have the law of conservation of energy. That applies when you have energy. So there are laws of information. Dr. Werner Gitt, one of the world's experts on information theory, says there is no known law of nature, no known process, and no known sequence of events which can cause information to originate by itself in matter. That appears to be a law of nature, that information never arises spontaneously. And so, you know, if you put a typewriter in a box and just let it sit there or just jumble it around like that randomly, it's not going to produce a work of Shakespeare. It's not going to do it, okay? Despite what students may want, they put their homework in there and just shake it up. It's not going to do it for you. It's not going to produce any new information. We sort of know that. Well, where does information come from? A mind, ultimately. Now, information can be copied, and it doesn't have, the process of copying doesn't have to be a mental process, but the source of information is always a mind. And that also appears to be a law of nature. When its progress along the chain of transmission events is traced backwards, every piece of information leads to a mental source, the mind of the sender. So what he's saying there is that information can be copied many times. I mean, if you have information in a book, where did that information come from? Probably from a machine that makes lots of books simultaneously, right? Well, where did the machine get its information? From a computer, probably. Where did it get its information? From another computer. You trace it backwards, eventually you'll end up with a mind. Somebody wrote it. If it's creative information, it always goes back to a mind. There are no known exceptions to this. This is a law of nature. Now, that's very interesting because, of course, in DNA, what do we have? Information. Yeah. And it's been copied many times. The information in your DNA, you got it from your parents, and they got it from their parents. It's been copied many times, but ultimately it has to go back to a mind. And see, that makes sense in the creation worldview because information goes back to, all the way back to Adam and Eve, and they got it from God. And the original organisms that God created, they got their information and their DNA from God. The information's been copied many times into our present state, and some of it's been lost due to mutations and natural selection. And we have some little problems from time to time. You have lower back pain or hair loss or whatever it is. That's due to little mistakes that have crept into the human genome. But really, information is not compatible with evolution. And you know, the funny thing is, in their heart of hearts, evolutionists know that information does not come about by chance. They know it always goes back to a mind. And I did a little social experiment to prove this a while back. There was an article that appeared on my blog. I have a blog, jasonlisle.com. And there was an article that appeared on there called On the Origin of Articles by Means of Natural Selection. You get the idea. Okay, and so the article tries to persuade you that articles have no authors, that they are just an accumulation of typos. And you know, most typos make an article worse, but occasionally a typo, you might imagine, might make an article better. And so those are preserved and copied, and eventually articles get longer and better as they're copied over millions of years, right? And that explains why articles use, for example, the same words, like the word "the" is in many different articles. Now, how could that be unless they're biologically related from a common ancestor, right? Anyway, it goes through and tries to persuade you, using all of the tricks that evolutionists use, to persuade you that articles have no authors, but are merely the random chance process guided by typos and natural selection. And the funny thing is, when this appeared on I can't take credit for writing it because it would defeat the purpose, but when it appeared on my blog, a lot of evolutionists chimed in. I allow people to comment on that. And they said, we know you wrote this, Dr. Lisle. I said, how do you know? How do you know that I wrote it? Did you see me write it? No? You're taking it on faith? That's not very scientific, is it? Well, we know what? That it's got information in it? See, they can't go that way because DNA has information in it. So if they say information requires a creator, I've got them. And they can't, and yet they couldn't figure out any other way to say it. Well, we know, we've seen other people write art. Yeah, but did you see me write this one? Well, no. Well, then, that's pretty much blind faith. I mean, if you want to believe that way, fine, but keep it in church, man. You'll have to get on there later and look at some of the comments. It was really funny, and it was fun for me to play the part of the evolutionist for a change, because I got to use the same fallacies that they use in defending their position, and none of them could really defend their position without giving up evolution, you see. It's really interesting. SETI is another example of proof that evolutionists really do know that information comes from intelligence. You've heard of SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. They have these radio dishes pointed out into space, listening for alien signals, alien radio signals. Now, there are lots of radio signals in space, ladies and gentlemen. The sun gives off radio. I can listen to that. It sounds like static, kind of. There are other stars give off radio signals. Galaxies do. There are things called pulsars that give off these little pip, 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 like that, these regular pulses. So with all these radio sources out in space, how would you distinguish an intelligent radio transmission from all of these natural ones? And of course, the folks at SETI would tell you, well, of course, the intelligent signal would have information in it, right? It'll have some kind of meaningful message. Indeed, if we got instructions from space on how to build a warp drive, and we built it and it worked, wow, that would probably convince even me that there's probably life out there. I don't think there is life out there, but it would convince me, wouldn't it? Because, hey, information always comes from a mind. And yet you point that in the other direction. You have them look through a microscope at DNA. That didn't come from a mind. That's just random chance. All that information. It's inconsistent. It shows that in their heart of hearts, they really do know God.